I'd like to thank all three of our panelists for great papers this afternoon, which I think came at a really appropriate moment right after that plenary session after lunch where we were all talking about the future of our discipline. We have a great audience here as well, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions, and so I am going to keep my comments very short since we're running over a bit too, and maybe just raise, I guess, three issues or sort of themes that come out of all three of these papers for me. The first of these is that all of our panelists suggest that there are today digital tools that have the potential to really reinvigorate our discipline by giving us new ways to analyze, interrogate, and visualize historical data, and thus to maybe perhaps change the questions we're asking or to frame them in a slightly different way. But it strikes me also as slightly ironic that the subtitle of the panel today was Beyond the Archive, because one of the big issues that all three of you addressed was the way in which the use of these digital tools asks us to think about data collection in the archives in different kinds of ways, because metadata plays a huge role in shaping the way that we can use digital tools. And so how you collect data, how you classify that data, how you then prepare the data for use by digital tools can be an enormously time-consuming process. And I think both David and Jill sort of raised the question about maybe asking those kinds of questions before you go into the archive, and thinking about the kind of analysis you might engage in before you collect the data in the first place. The second question I think that is sort of implicit in all of these papers is that the digital world is maybe changing how we talk to our audiences in fairly critical ways, whether it's audiences of other scholars or audiences of students, and that digital tools implicitly offer us new ways to engage audiences very quickly. And I'm wondering on that note as well about the extent to which the very existence of digital tools shapes the kinds of questions we even bring to the table. And thirdly, I would say that all three of these papers, I think, implicitly raise issues about pedagogy and historical teaching in the 21st century. We are living in a world where the majority of our undergraduate students are what we might call born digital natives, or if they are not quite there already, they will be in the next decade. They are students who grew up with iPads in their hands and who are used to constant stimulation from a whole variety of digital media technologies. But do they actually understand how the information that is transmitted by those technologies is shaped by a whole variety of factors, whether that is computer algorithms, the very classification of metadata, and other factors that really shape the output of the digital world. And so I wonder, do all of these tools that you've presented today offer us a challenge as teachers as well to find new ways to teach digital literacy to our students? Because it seems to me that as historians, our primary task is to teach students to analyze critically a variety of sources about the past, but that maybe what we should also be doing is teaching them to think more critically about the information they consume today. And doing that involves digital literacy. It means understanding how Google Books works. It means understanding how Google Maps works. It means understanding how the basic questions that you type into a search engine are shaped by a whole complex variety of factors. And that maybe, this is sort of a challenge, I think, to all of us to really think about how to teach those basic skills as part of this broader civic education that we often claim to be offering as humanists. So those are kind of the three issues that I think sort of tie all of these papers together, but I know we're going to have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Okay. We're going to open up for questions now. Grace up front has 2 microphones. She's going to hand them back as people raise their hands, but don't be surprised when it doesn't project anything. So.
Hi, Julie Landweber from Montclair State, New Jersey. My question is, it's inspired by 3 great papers. All of you could answer, but it's mostly, I think, for David. You've generated a lot of really fascinating visual material, but it seems so complex with all the layers. how it's useful for making you think more creatively about your material and your research is very clear from your talk. But do you see a way to also share this in publications, or do you see other formats where you would want to share this rich material that you've generated? I guess that's what I'm wondering. It's a huge amount of effort that you've put into making things that might only be useful to you.
That's a very good question. Because of the intense visualization required, sometimes it's difficult to communicate what you want to share easily. And I found two solutions so far. First is to rely on very narrow descriptions and whatever representations a publisher will allow, and that often means one plate that does it all. And that's tricky, and that takes some thinking. Second, I think it's increasingly common and easy to refer a reader to a stable, hopefully permanent place where they themselves can go manipulate the data. So ultimately, this is the goal in my larger thinking, is to make the GIS in particular available for anyone. And this is sort of a larger purpose in Vietnam or here, so that the people anywhere can ask questions of the data. But I have to get there first. So I haven't fundamentally resolved. I don't have a fundamental answer yet, but I am reflecting on it, so I appreciate that. Yep.
Yeah, I'm Rob Schneider from Indiana University. This is, I guess, to David as well, but I think it addresses all of you in some respect, but I will make it more pointed towards your work. I guess my question is, do you have, what you presented us seems very inductive. That is to say, it's almost as if you don't have an a priori notion of what the causality, if you can put it in those terms, of revolt are, and that you're just sort of you're trying to line up a bunch of variables and see which match up. I mean, you've eliminated the immiseration thesis, which I suppose is one sort of finding, but then it seems that you're just open to a whole catalog of very disparate variables, and I'm wondering whether that's really true. That is, whether one can really be that sort of blank slate-like. What your work reminds me of is Charles Tilley's work on the Vendée, published in 1964, who wanted to retrospectively predict the geography of revolt in this region, and he came though with a kind of quasi-Marxist view of class relationships. But he, in doing his work, I mean, he didn't impose that upon it. He found a much more nuanced and quite sort of surprising geography of the penetration of market relationships and proto-industry. So I guess my question for you is, I mean, I imagine, to me, I would find it hard to believe that you don't have some sort of sense of what the variables, the relevant and important variables are in retrospectively predicting revolt. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm asking you that.
Sure. I mean, I assume we all come to the questions that we've introduced here with some idea of what might be at play. I mean, and certainly maybe Charles Tilley's work had more of an impact on me and it's resided in me. However, I think that the question I'm bringing to this, I'm trying to understand, I guess, if in fact there is one singular event. And in fact, what historians need to do is to perhaps look at this as two or three entirely, or somewhat separate parallel rebellions that happen to occur at the same time. And that's what I'm beginning to see. But the region is quite large. It's a different environment. There are many different factors. So yes, I agree with you. But I think that coming into this, I think that there were probably two or three rebellions going on at the same time, that sectarian differences had a great deal at play, and also that, in fact, people were not protesting against colonialism as much as they were asking it to live up to the expectations that it promised. That's as far as I've gotten.
Can I add something? So you might not, well, there's a brief instance. I'm sort of a database person. I did a database for the dissertation that became my first book, and I'm doing a big new database for this Bordeaux stuff. The way I approached it was I looked at a run of documents and I eyeballed. And things were like this at the beginning of the run, and they were different at the end. And I just then sort of turned on the vacuum cleaner, if you will. And on the assumption that if things are like this here and things are like there, if I look at all the documents, somewhere along the way I'm going to figure out what the shift is. So recognizing that there's a change is a lot different, I think, than coming in. I mean, again, as David just said, then you have a variety of possible explanations, and you see what the data gives, and you try, so I think you have to be somewhat open to what the database is going to answer, what the database is going to be. But I admit that I picked the question.
My question is more methodological rather than, like how do questions get us started exploring data in different ways? And that is, for David in particular, if you were to have done what you did with old-style regression analysis, factor after factor after factor, you're going to start to get higher correlations and lower correlations, and you're going to start ruling out certain things, and you're going to add another column and another column as you keep asking these questions, right? But maybe what you miss is a map that shows a 2% slope, and you have to figure out how to put that into a column or whatever. But doesn't that actually give you something stronger in terms of correlations than the visualization? Now, we're all addicted to visualization, given the media we're dealing with, and maybe we think that way more easily now. But at what point do we cross over to really having a more effective tool when we've given up a tool we had because, well, they were using that in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and, we can't get any funding for that anymore, so let's do GIS, right? So at what point do you think your framing of the methodology has actually gone maybe backwards in a sense? It's cost you even more time because it was fun and novel, but maybe because you had a lot of dead ends, right? Maybe not the most productive.
That's a good point, and I accept that. I think that the potential response to that has to do with the particular environment in which you may not eventually know what factors to eliminate in regression without exploring them in perception. Meaning, for example, at the conclusion, I would not necessarily have known initially to look for family clusters in particular locales going into the analysis. And for me, perhaps being more attuned to the visual in that regard, I wouldn't have, in the method you're suggesting, I wouldn't have come to that point because I wouldn't have seen it. And then also, because it's a relatively large regional study, if I do this across the whole region, I think I'll pick up patterns that would be more difficult, at least in my case, to see in a tabular sense. I understand perfectly what you're saying. Yeah. We can be addicted to the eye candy, to the eye cocaine that is GIS, but I do think that in this particular, it reveals factors we wouldn't see.
We have time for one more shorter question, so if you have a long question.
I'm Julie Hodwick from the University of Texas at Austin. I have a kind of a methodological question too about what we're doing here and where we're gaining something and where are we sort of doing something in a new sexy form that we could have done in a different way before. And I think some of these most simple things, the gains are clear. Like Alan, I'm also having like a strange adventure into the world past 1750 and into print culture. And for another, same thing, Google Scholar, you search the affiche in an hour in my office. I was looking for Rousseau in the classified ads. I found out all kinds of funny, cool things, in an hour in Texas. I plugged them into the article I was writing. I felt very 21st century. And it was cool. It was great. It was really an advance for me to quickly be able to find that kind of information. So Jillian, I was thinking about yours, and I think your students are going to love mapping this. Some of my undergraduates have been mapping early modern, different kind of early modern patterns from legal materials, and they love it. And some of them are so ambitious. One of mine mapped 650 cases for one term paper last spring. So I think they're going to love it. But when I look at your map there, and somebody's just made me some maps like that, and I admire you for doing it rather than having to find someone who can do it for you. When you read a case where somebody moves 14 times in 4 years, you already know that they're very mobile, and the sort of series of likely consequences, not being very rooted in the community and so on, from that question. So when we do this kind of analysis, is it leading you to different questions or to different answers than you would have done just from reading the cases and thinking about, I know where that is in Paris, so I know like the last case, the last map you showed, they were moving a very small distance across the Marais, several moves within, a couple of 100 yards, whereas the other ones that you were showing, they were moving bigger distances. So this is just about my uncertainty, not any kind of criticism of what you're doing.
I started doing things just sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall because I didn't know where a lot of the addresses were since those streets were demolished. So I wondered, I don't know what the street name is.
Yeah.
So I used this reference book that someone wrote during Haussmannization, detailing which streets became which other streets, to try to figure out whether these locations were all clustered or whether they were in more disparate parts of the city. So it really was just kind of trial and error to figure out whether it was 14 places in one area in Paris or whether they were wide-ranging.
Right.
And the other reason I just started, I think your point makes a lot of sense that if they're moving 14 times, I already know they're mobile, what's the point? I was just trying to figure out other patterns too, for instance, why certain women went to certain commissioners. Because when I first started out, I was mapping women in their location when they filed a complaint vis-a-vis the commissioners, and finding out that some women just went to the commissioner that was closest to them, but there were some commissioners who people walked all across town to get to. And then, that led me to really look at the sources differently and wonder, why is this woman, spending a half a day to go all the way across the city to this one commissioner. So it was just sort of a grab bag of questions I was trying to answer by throwing, everything out there. Also wondering, when women ran away from home and they were missing for several years before their parents found them, how far did they have to be for no one in the neighborhood to know that they were, the cobbler's daughter, and then go back and tell their parents? Because I did discover that some women, ran away from home, but they were really just like a 15-minute walk. But their parents didn't figure out where they were for years. So there are some loose ends I still haven't tied up in doing the mapping, because on the one hand, people are mobile and it's really easy for people to get around, for these women to get around. But then on the other hand, it's really difficult for the authorities and their parents to track them down when they go missing. I'm as you can tell, I'm sort of in the beginning stages, but I guess kind of like David, just putting everything out there to see what patterns show up, because I know that when I was looking at these sources originally, I was blind to certain dynamics, which is why I think going to a lot of these dead ends is really valuable, because you don't consider certain reasons or certain explanations for what's happening. You don't consider certain patterns existing. So yeah, mapping out the 14 just was sort of a way to figure out how wide was the orbit these women were circulating in.
I'm going to use my chair power to call an end to this very rich panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for inviting me, and I'll lead you in one last.
I was going to use this.